Racist cop pulls over elderly black man, then learns he's a Supreme Court justice. He was just an old black man behind the wheel of a classic car until the cops saw his ID and froze. What was supposed to be a routine traffic stop turned into a moment that exposed everything wrong with how we see race power and justice in America. You won't believe who he really was or how his silence spoke louder than a protest. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. The morning fog hadn't yet lifted over the quiet outskirts of Savannah, Georgia, when Dylan Kerrigan spotted the car. It moved slowly, deliberately, a matte black 1970 Cadillac Fleetwood gliding down Highway 17 as though it had all the time in the world. Bryce sat alone in his cruiser, sipping stale coffee, radio turned down low. There was nothing urgent on the scanner. No robberies, no accidents, just the dull hum of routine. But something about that car bothered him. It wasn't just old, it wasn't just slow, it was out of place. And in Bryce's mind, being out of place was often the first sign of trouble. He pulled into the lane behind the Cadillac, watching it. The license plate was faded, barely legible. The driver, a lone, elderly black man wearing a gray fedora and sitting as upright as a preacher at a funeral. That too seemed strange to Bryce. The car was too vintage, the man too composed. The whole image didn't fit the template his instincts had sharpened over the years. Bryce didn't think. He acted. With one flick of his fingers, the cruiser's red and blue lights blazed to life. The siren chirped once like a bark from a dog who'd just found something it didn't like. The Cadillac pulled over without hesitation. No sudden movements, no attempt to flee, just a quiet, graceful turn onto the gravel shoulder. Bryce stepped out, boots hitting the pavement with a kind of authority only someone who never questions his own power can command. His hand hovered near his holster, not out of fear, but habit. A habit born from dozens, maybe hundreds of stops, just like this. People who didn't look right. People who didn't match the neighborhood. People who moved just a little too slowly to be doing nothing wrong. As he approached the vehicle, Bryce noticed there was no nervousness from the driver, no fidgeting, no forced politeness, just two black-gloved hands resting calmly on the wheel and a face turned forward, eyes fixed on the road ahead, like the stop hadn't even happened. "Good morning," Bryce said flatly. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" The man turned his head slowly. No fear in his eyes. No irritation either, just stillness. The kind that makes you feel inexplicably like you're the one being observed. "No," the man replied, voice calm as Riverstone. "But I trust you'll tell me." Bryce bristled. Something in the man's tone, measured precise, made him feel as though the power dynamic had shifted ever so slightly. He glanced at the dashboard. No air freshener hanging. No visible infractions. He sniffed. No scent of weed. No broken tail light. The car was old, yes, but clean. Law-abiding, at least by any standard he could justify on paper. Still, he pressed on. License and registration. The man nodded slowly, reaching into the glove box. No sudden movements, no backtalk, no complaint. He handed Bryce a leather wallet worn at the edges and a laminated ID card that gleamed faintly in the morning haze. Bryce looked down and stopped. The emblem was unfamiliar. Gold embossed with a thin line of text etched around the seal. He squinted, read again. United States Supreme Court Associate Justice. He blinked. At first he thought it was a prank, some kind of novelty card. He flipped it over. It had security codes, federal clearance markings, a signature line signed in a firm, looping script. Langston Graves. His throat dried. He didn't say anything for a moment. His fingers hovered awkwardly over his radio. Part of him wanted to call it in, confirm it was real. Part of him didn't want to risk sounding foolish to dispatch. And another part, the smallest but loudest, felt the beginnings of panic rise in his chest because he knew that name. Not personally, but he'd heard it before on TV and newspapers. Langston Graves. Langston Graves, civil rights attorney turned federal circuit judge turned Supreme Court appointee, a man who had spent his entire life dismantling the very biases Bryce was now enacting on the side of a sleepy southern highway. "I'm sorry," Bryce said quickly. "There's just been reports of older vehicles running tags that don't match." The judge said nothing. Bryce forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just doing my job." Langston Graves. Langston Graves leaned back slightly in his seat, his gaze still locked ahead as though the horizon held more relevance than the man standing outside his window. "I understand," he said softly. "Many have said that, especially when they didn't know who I was." Bryce felt the words hit harder than any shouted protest. No rage, no accusation, just the unspoken implication. "You only care now because I have power." The silence stretched. From behind him, a car slowed. A teenager in the passenger seat pointed her phone out the window, recording. The driver raised an eyebrow. Whispers fluttered. Bryce turned his body slightly, trying to block the camera's view. Another car rolled by, another glance. People were watching. Suddenly, this wasn't a routine stop anymore. Suddenly, this was a moment, and Bryce Officer Dylan Kerrigan felt like the only person who hadn't realized that until it was too late. He handed back the ID with trembling fingers. "You're free to go, sir." Langston Graves didn't move. He looked at Bryce for the first time. Really looked. And what Bryce saw wasn't anger. It wasn't pity either. It was disappointment. Deep, ancient disappointment. Like the face of someone who had watched 1,000 versions of this moment unfold and still hadn't grown numb to it. "I was on my way," Langston Graves said quietly, "to give a eulogy for a man who fought so that being pulled over wouldn't feel like a sentencing. He reached for the gear shift, but it seems we're not done fighting yet." The Cadillac rolled back onto the road, slow and steady, leaving a trail of silence that stretched far behind it, longer, louder than any siren ever could. And Officer Dylan Kerrigan stood on the gravel shoulder badge, heavy on his chest, heart pounding in his throat. Not because he had made a mistake, but because for the first time in his life, he was beginning to understand what kind of mistake it truly was. Dylan Kerrigan had been a police officer for 12 years. In those years, his uniform had become second skin. His badge a symbol not only of authority, but of identity. He had walked into every precinct, every gas station, every courtroom with the quiet confidence of a man whose title carried weight even when his words didn't. But that morning on the side of Highway 17, as the Cadillac disappeared behind the veil of trees and rising sun, something fundamental shifted, something so small and quiet it should have been dismissible. Yet it wasn't. Back in his cruiser, the silence was different now. It wasn't the comfortable quiet he used to savor before a shift kicked into chaos. It was the kind that crept into your chest and asked questions you weren't ready to answer. The kind that didn't shout, but left echoes behind. He looked down at the badge resting against his chest. It hadn't changed. The silver shone under the windshield's filtered light, still emblazoned with the same words to serve and protect. But now those words felt like a dare. Who had he really been serving in that moment? What had he been protecting? His pride, his assumptions. Bryce had spent his career believing in instincts. They were what set good officers apart from the rest, or so he'd been told. He prided himself on reading the situation, feeling when something was off, acting fast, when others hesitated. But what if that feeling wasn't instinct at all? What if it was bias dressed in the uniform of intuition? He didn't like the thought. It scraped at the edges of his self-image like sandpaper. But the face of Langston Graves. Langston Graves, the Supreme Court justice he had pulled over just an hour ago, refused to leave his mind. That composed, steady gaze had offered no accusations, but had somehow unraveled Bryce more than any confrontation ever could. He drove the cruiser back to the station, moving on autopilot. The road signs blurred past. The chatter on the radio was just noise. As he pulled into the lot, he sat for a long moment before stepping out. He walked inside. No one greeted him differently. No alarms had been raised. Everything looked exactly the same, and yet nothing felt familiar anymore. In the locker room, Bryce removed his duty belt and sat on the bench, elbows on his knees, hands gripping the badge like it might slip from his grasp. Across from him was a long mirror cracked slightly in the corner, the kind every officer saw at the beginning and end of a shift. It had never meant anything before, just a surface. But now, it was a challenge. He stared at his reflection. Not the uniform, not the badge, but the man beneath it. The lines in his face that had grown deeper. The eyes that used to carry resolve, now carrying something he couldn't name. Regret, shame, doubt. He remembered a training seminar from his early years. A supervisor had said, "The badge doesn't make you right. It gives you the responsibility to be right." He hadn't thought much of it then. It sounded like the kind of phrase people said to sound noble. But today it echoed differently. What if he hadn't lived up to that responsibility? Later that afternoon, Bryce found himself sitting in front of a computer in the precinct's break room. Curiosity, no guilt, drove him to type in Langston Graves. The results poured in. Articles, interviews, law reviews, images of Langston Graves standing beside civil rights leaders, speaking before Congress, quietly shaking hands with families freed from unjust sentences. And there in one video, Langston Graves delivering a speech at a graduation ceremony. "I've been judged before I ever became a judge." Langston Graves had said to the graduates, not for what I'd done, but for what I looked like, where I stood, how I carried myself. And yet I chose not to become what I was assumed to be. I chose the law not to be above others, but to remind the law itself what justice should feel like. Bryce stopped the video. His throat tightened. It wasn't just that he had pulled over a powerful man. It was that he had attempted to diminish someone who had spent his life ensuring others couldn't be diminished. Not through force, not through intimidation, but through calm, unshakable integrity. And somehow Bryce had thought he held the power in that exchange. That night, Bryce sat in his living room, the house quiet, his wife asleep upstairs. He held the badge again, this time not as a symbol of pride, but as a question. Had he wanted to serve, or had he wanted to shield himself from self-examination? He thought about other stops faces that blurred together. Now, how many had he pulled over for no real reason? How many times had he convinced himself that instinct justified intrusion? How many people had driven away from his cruiser feeling violated, afraid, humiliated, and he had never once questioned whether they should have? He couldn't sleep. In the morning, Bryce walked into the precinct early and requested a meeting with his captain. It wasn't a resignation. It wasn't a confession. It was something harder, a request for accountability. "I need to talk to someone," he said, "about training, about how we do things, about how I have been doing things." The captain raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" "No," Bryce replied, "but I want to make it okay before someone else has to carry the cost of my silence." It was the first time in 12 years he had entered that office without the shield of righteousness. And it wouldn't be the last, because now he understood the badge only has power when it reflects back on her. And if the mirror starts showing something else, it's not the mirror that needs changing. It's the man staring into it. It began with a whisper, not from a person, but from the uniform itself. The same navy blue fabric that once felt like armor against the world now clung tighter to Dylan Kerrigan's shoulders, heavier than it had ever been. It didn't sag with wear, it sagged with weight. The invisible kind, the kind that accumulates when the truths you've ignored begin to surface and stare back at you. The morning after his meeting with the captain, Bryce entered the Monroe Police Department to find things exactly the same. coffee brewing boots echoing across tile officers trading tired jokes near the evidence lockers. But for Bryce, nothing felt familiar anymore. He moved slower, not from fatigue, but from an unease that lingered like static in the air. No one had said anything outright. No one needed to. The story of the stop had begun its silent spread. Someone must have seen the footage, not the official body cam. There wasn't much of that left intact, but someone on the street had filmed part of the encounter with Justice Langston Graves. Langston Graves. A few seconds enough to raise questions enough to pull the thread. A week later, the department received its first official inquiry from the State Judicial Oversight Office. It was worded politely, but its meaning was precise. They wanted documentation logs, procedures, body cam data, any correspondence. Bryce was told it was routine, but he could feel the chill settling in the seams of his reputation. Suddenly, the jokes at the locker stopped when he passed by. He was no longer just Officer Dylan Kerrigan, patrolman with high clearance stats and instinct that never missed. Now he was the officer who pulled over a Supreme Court judge without probable cause. The same judge who'd authored decisions on racial bias and systemic accountability. The same man who dedicated his life to building bridges. Bryce hadn't even noticed he was walking over. Bryce didn't deny what happened. He couldn't. But admitting wasn't the same as understanding. The unraveling had only just begun. It wasn't just the review board or the questions from upstairs. It was the way he began to question his own memories. The small moments, the patterns, the faces. He went back through old logs not to prepare a defense, but to find clarity. What he found was something worse. He saw a pattern he hadn't dared to name. More stops involving people of color. More incidents labeled as field investigation based on suspicious movement or nonverbal resistance. More phrases that sounded like procedure but were nothing more than masks for something deeper. And there, buried in a routine traffic stop from 2 years ago, he found a report he barely remembered writing. The driver was a young black teacher returning from a late-night shift at the community center. Bryce had noted seemed agitated, avoided eye contact, possible concealment of something. But now, reading it again, he remembered the man hadn't been hiding anything. He'd been tired, worn polite even. Bryce had written him a citation for a cracked taillight and gone on with his shift. But the man had likely gone home wondering why he was ever pulled over in the first place. Bryce stared at the screen, the incident report glowing back at him like a quiet indictment. The uniform he wore had never been questioned by those around him. But now it began to feel like a disguise, something that let him walk through injustice without having to see it. And others were seeing it too. Media outlets started sniffing around the story. Local blogs posted the video with headlines like, "Judge pulled over for driving while black." National columnists started asking bigger questions not just about Bryce, but about Monroe, about the patterns of enforcement that went unnoticed for too long. Then came the phone call from his son's school. "Mr. Dylan Kerrigan, we had a situation during civics' class." Bryce froze. "Your son was visibly upset when another student mentioned the video circulating. We just wanted you to be aware." He hung up and sat in silence. Later that night, he found his son sitting at the kitchen table, notebook open, but no homework done. Instead, the boy had written just one sentence. "How do I tell people I'm proud of my dad if they think he hurt someone?" Bryce didn't answer. He couldn't because he didn't have a name for what he had done. Not in legal terms, not in departmental code, but he knew it had left a mark, one he couldn't wash off with procedure. The following morning, Bryce asked to be reassigned from field duty. It wasn't suspension. It wasn't punishment. It was choice. "I don't think I should be the one pulling people over right now," he said. The captain nodded, unreadable. Back at his desk, Bryce took off the uniform shirt and folded it carefully. Underneath, he wore a simple white undershirt. No badge, no nameplate, just fabric. It felt strange at first walking through the precinct without the uniform. Like walking into a house you used to live in only to find the furniture rearranged. In that quiet, Bryce began reviewing case files from others. Taking a desk roll meant sorting paperwork, closing pending citations, cross-referencing department codes. But he also began paying attention to patterns he had never noticed before. Which officers had the highest stop-to-citation ratios? Which neighborhoods were most frequently patrolled? What language was used in reporting and when? And slowly the uniform he had once defended began to unspool itself in his mind. It had never been about the fabric or the badge or the weight on the belt. It was about what it let you ignore, what it gave you permission to overlook. By the end of the month, Bryce had filled a personal notebook with more observations than he had in 12 years of active duty. Questions, discrepancies, words that once looked like order now looked like camouflage. He wasn't out to burn the house down, but he wasn't going to pretend it was clean anymore. The unraveling of a uniform wasn't about disgrace. It was about finally noticing the thread had been loose all along. It started as a local story. A routine traffic stop in Monroe, Alabama. A black Lincoln pulled over by Dylan Kerrigan. An elderly black man behind the wheel. No raised voices, no arrests. On the surface, nothing remarkable. But what the world learned days later was that the man sitting quietly in that driver's seat was not a retiree heading to the market or a parishioner en route to Sunday service. It was Justice Langston Graves. Langston Graves, a sitting Supreme Court judge, one of the most respected minds in modern constitutional law. The moment that detail surfaced, everything changed. It began with a still frame. A single clip shared from a teenager's cell phone capturing the moment Justice Langston Graves stepped out of his vehicle. Not defiant, not afraid, simply dignified. His hands rested at his sides, his eyes calm but unyielding. The clip spread across social media like a gust through dry leaves. The caption was simple. "This is who we stop in broad daylight." There were no special effects, no added commentary, but something about it struck a collective nerve. Maybe it was the composure of the judge. Maybe it was the officer's uncertainty. Or maybe deeper still, it was a country finally seeing itself in a moment it could no longer justify or unsee. By the end of that week, news anchors were no longer debating if the stop was justified. They were asking how it ever became possible for someone like Justice Langston Graves to be stopped at all. Not because he was powerful, but because he had become symbolic of something too many people had silently endured for too long. Church pulpits began referencing it. College classrooms paused their curriculum to replay the clip. Law professors rewrote their discussion modules to include the Monroe stop as a case study on implicit bias in procedural justice. What had once been viewed as standard discretion was now held under the microscope of moral reckoning in neighborhoods across cities like Chicago, Atlanta, Detroit, and Oakland. Community leaders began organizing what would you have seen sessions forums where residents and officers sat down and analyzed traffic stop footage together, asking not just what happened, but what was seen, assumed, feared, or missed. It wasn't training. It was transformation. In one such forum in Harlem, a young woman stood up and said, "If the law can't tell the difference between a threat and a judge, maybe it's time the law looked inward." Her words went viral not because she was famous, but because she had said what thousands were feeling. High school debate teams took it further. Students argued not about technicalities, but about the foundations of perception. A 10th grader in Minneapolis asked during a mock trial, "Why do we need someone to be a Supreme Court judge to see their humanity?" The room went quiet. Judges gave no feedback. They didn't need to. Ripples moved faster than laws. Art installations began appearing in cities across the country. Empty judges' benches placed in parks, intersections, even shopping centers with plaques that read, "Would you see him now?" Museums began curating exhibits on Black dignity in public spaces, highlighting the cost of being invisible until power reveals you. The judiciary responded too, not with a statement, but with a shift. During a televised legal summit, multiple justices refused to take center stage. Instead, they sat in the audience, silent, deliberate. The symbolism didn't go unnoticed. One moderator whispered, "This is what it looks like when justice sits with the people." Even within police departments, reforms began to surface, not because of mandates, but because the silence of the uniform had become deafening. In Los Angeles, officers began including a new line in their stop reports. Was empathy practiced? It wasn't a rule, just a prompt, but it changed how reports were written. Then came the letters. Thousands of them handwritten, typed, spoken into video form, from citizens who had never been pulled over and from those who had far too many times, from retirees and teenagers, teachers and pastors, all addressed to Justice Langston Graves. None asking for him to speak, but thanking him for what his silence had revealed. At the heart of this ripple wasn't rage. It was recognition that a man who had spent his life ensuring fairness under law could still be seen as less than when stripped of title. That dignity is not a reward, but a birthright. And that the moment you need a badge to be treated with respect is the moment the system has forgotten why it exists. And so across the country, the question spread, not spoken loudly, but whispered in boardrooms, classrooms, living rooms: if this can happen to him, who else have we already failed? No one had an answer, but finally they were asking. In the weeks that followed the stop, Justice Langston Graves did not grant interviews. He issued no public statement, offered no opinion pieces or televised commentary. He returned to his work at the court with the same quiet dignity he carried in his Lincoln that morning. And yet across the country, his silence began to echo louder than any speech he might have delivered. At first it confused people. The nation waited for a soundbite for a headline, grabbing quote that could be printed in bold or looped on talk shows, but none came. Instead, his silence was filled by the voices of others. Voices that had been waiting for permission to speak, or perhaps waiting for a reason they could no longer deny. It was in this stillness that his legacy took form, not built on policy or power, but on the unintended truth that justice should never have to wear a name tag to be recognized. His was not the legacy he asked for, but it became the legacy the nation needed. In law schools, the case of Langston Graves via's misperception became required reading not as an official case law, but as a moral study. Professors posed questions not about guilt or innocence, but about assumptions, not about legality, but about awareness. Students wrote essays not to defend an argument, but to understand the anatomy of a mistake. In one such classroom, a young black student stood up and said, "I always thought I'd have to work twice as hard to be seen. I never thought I'd have to be a Supreme Court judge just to be believed." The room didn't applaud. It didn't need to. That kind of truth doesn't seek approval. It demands acknowledgement. Meanwhile, Dylan Kerrigan had been reassigned. Official reports cited procedural review. Unofficially, it was a quiet extraction, a move to limit the fallout. But Dylan Kerrigan had changed not in his posture or performance, but in the way he looked at people during stops. There was a hesitation now, not from fear, but from an inner reckoning he had no script for. He no longer used the word routine when describing his work, because he had come to understand that what feels routine for some may feel like survival for others. He no longer called it instinct. He started calling it a lens. And that lens, once unexamined, now carried the weight of a name he would never forget. Elsewhere, conversations began to take root, in spaces they had never dared enter before. In community boardrooms, where officers and residents once sat on opposite ends, there were now shared tables. Not every meeting ended with agreement, but every voice was heard, and that alone marked a kind of shift. Across dinner tables and barber hops in union halls and Sunday school classrooms, people began telling their own stories. Not about judges or cops, but about dignity. Stories that had gathered dust in silence. Now, sweeping through a nation, learning that history doesn't just happen in monuments or marches. Sometimes it unfolds in the quiet refusal of a man to be belittled. The most unexpected tribute came not from a courtroom or a Congress floor, but from a small-town middle school. A class assignment asked students to write about a leader who changed something without giving a speech. One child drew a picture of a black man in a car, hands on the wheel, face calm. Underneath, in crooked handwriting, they wrote, "He didn't yell, He didn't fight, but he made people see. The drawing was never displayed in a gallery. It didn't go viral. But when a teacher quietly taped it to her classroom door, every student that passed by knew exactly who it was. Not because they saw his face, but because they had learned to see his meaning. And that was the legacy Langston Graves left, not carved into granite, but carried in awareness. He reminded a country that justice is not a uniform, nor a title, nor the absence of conflict. It is the presence of respect given freely and without demand. The legacy we never asked for is the one that made us ask harder questions, the one that turned silence into a mirror, the one that forced us to confront not just how we treat power, but how we perceive humanity. Justice Langston Graves drove away that day, as he always did, unrushed, upright, with nothing to prove. But in doing so, he rewrote something deeper than law. He rewrote the definition of presence. And we, the witnesses of that silent verdict, now carry the responsibility to ensure we never go blind to dignity again. Langston Graves. Langston Graves was never looking to become a symbol. He wasn't chasing a headline, nor did he speak loudly or demand recognition. He was simply an old man driving a well-kept Lincoln through the quiet streets of Charleston, headed to honor a chapter of his past. But what happened on that roadside the moment a uniformed officer saw not a man, but a profile became more than just an interaction. It became a reckoning. Not because Langston Graves resisted, but because he didn't. Not because he confronted, but because his calm composure spoke louder than protest. What began as a traffic stop ended as a mirror held up to a nation, forcing it to ask, who gets to be presumed innocent, who is granted dignity without explanation, and who must still carry proof of worth in their pockets? Throughout the story, Langston Graves' silence was not passivity. It was power. Every pause, every calm reply, every refusal to escalate carried the weight of decades spent upholding the very justice system that now doubted him. Dylan Kerrigan, who initiated the stop, wasn't a villain in the traditional sense. He was a product of unchecked bias and unchallenged authority. But through this single interaction, we saw how a crack in the armor of assumption could widen into a fracture of self-awareness. Dylan Kerrigan's journey, his shift from instinct to introspection, echoes the journey so many in positions of power must make. He did not lose his job, but he lost something more, revealing the unquestioned confidence in his own righteousness. And then came the ripple, the footage, the bystanders, the silence that became a national conversation. Students rewrote essays, officers rewrote protocols, civilians rewrote expectations across schools, courtrooms, and city blocks. Langston Graves' presence lived on, not through speeches, but through the way people paused before judging. The way they asked names with care, the way they questioned procedures that had gone unchallenged for years. A man who had no intention of leading a movement did just that by refusing to shrink beneath disrespect and by choosing presence over performance. The lesson in this story isn't about one bad cop or one good man. It's about the space between perception and reality and how dangerous that space becomes when we fill it with assumption. It's about how power is most clearly tested, not when it's resisted, but when it's met with dignity. We are reminded that justice isn't just upheld in courtrooms or codified in laws. It's reflected in how we see one another in our everyday decisions, in our moments of pause, in our willingness to see humanity before authority. So what can we do? We can slow down before we judge. We can challenge our instincts when they're rooted in prejudice. We can teach our children that dignity isn't earned by titles, but honored in every interaction. And most of all, we can remember that silence doesn't always mean weakness. Sometimes it's the most powerful form of truth. If this story moved you even just for a moment, please consider subscribing to this channel. Your support helps us bring more meaningful, real-life stories like this to light. Help us keep the conversation going and help ensure voices like Langston Graves' never fade into silence again. In the end, Justice Langston Graves didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need handcuffs or headlines to prove a point. All it took was his presence. The quiet weight of a man who had spent his life defending the very justice that tried to overlook him. And yet this simple traffic stop revealed an uncomfortable truth. Even a Supreme Court justice can still be reduced to a stereotype in a matter of seconds. So here's the question I leave with you. If it takes power, fame, or status to be seen with dignity, what happens to those who have none of that? Was Officer Dylan Kerrigan just doing his job, or was he blinded by assumptions he never questioned? Is this a failure of one man or a mirror reflecting all of us? Share your thoughts below. I want to know, should a badge give someone the right to stop you based on nothing but a gut feeling? Does training fix this problem, or is it something much deeper? Your voice matters here. This is not just a video. This is a conversation we refuse to ignore. If this story made you pause, made you feel, or made you think differently, give it a like. Drop a comment. And hit that subscribe button for more real stories with real meaning from Soulful Stories 4.